Released in 1931, Dracula, directed by Todd Browning and based on the novel of the same name by Bram Stoker, was the film that not only kicked the classic run of Universal monster movies into full high gear, but also started sound horror films as we know them. While not the first iconic Dracula film, technically speaking, because Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau, came out first in 1922, Dracula in 1931 is easily the most iconic take on Stoker's classic work about the eponymous vampiric count. There's certainly been good to great iterations of Dracula that would come post-31, from Nosferatu the Vampire to the 1992 adaptation by Francis Ford Coppola, but the film starring Bela Lugosi has never been supplanted as the film considered by many to be the definitive golden standard of how to do a classic Dracula take, and it's safe to say that it will never be supplanted as such. So, this film is a first in a lot of ways, and is certainly the most famous and iconic Dracula movie, but how does it hold up in terms of overall quality? Well, that's certainly going to be an easier question to answer, at least for this video, than the question of which iteration of Dracula in the vast, and I do mean vast number of iterations, is the top dog of them all. So the discussion to answer that second question is gonna have to be saved for another time, assuming that will ever happen, because there's just so many Dracula movies that have come out and probably will keep on coming out that it's pretty much impossible to even have like a definitive answer. So that one may very well be a tough call in terms of deciding which one is the best. So for now, let's just talk about this one particular Dracula movie for the video. Anyway, no sense beating around the bush of Wolfbane here. Let's sink our teeth into this classic and discuss it, shall we? The basic gist in Dracula 31 is that a vampire named Count Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi, moves from Transylvania to London into Carfax Abbey in search for some blood drinking after acquiring the property from Renfield, played by Dwight Fry, who goes on to be his crazed servant. When the Count sets his sights on a young woman named Mina, played by Helen Chandler, Professor Van Helsing, played by Edward Van Sloan, begins his hunt to stop Dracula before his evil will can fully corrupt Mina into becoming one of his vampire brides forever. The plot is very straightforward. It doesn't exactly go much deeper than being a battle of wills between an overwhelming force of evil in the form of Count Dracula and the forces of good, which consist of Van Helsing, John Harker, and Dr. Seward to a certain extent, who are collectively the underdog in this case. That being said, the execution is still pretty strong in terms of maintaining the stakes, no pun intended, in a logical manner where Van Helsing has to convince everyone else into taking the necessary steps in thwarting Dracula due to the latter thriving and others simply not believing in something as extraordinary as a vampire on the prowl in their streets. And while the film moves at a creeping pace, the stakes are still high enough for the plot to be engaging, and there's enough going on throughout the film to where there's hardly a minute wasted. Now I will say that one glaring issue kind of involves a loose end that's sort of left untied regarding Lucy, who was killed by Dracula earlier in the film only to become a vampire who goes around looking for children to lure in and attack. After the news report of a little girl being attacked by Lucy, the film doesn't really follow up on it whatsoever. The only potential remnant of this particular thread is when we see Van Helsing and John Harker standing right outside Carfax Abbey while they witness Renfield sneaking into it. Though out of context, and it would be pretty darn fair in this case, Van Helsing and Harker may have been heading into the Abbey anyways to wait for and kill Dracula, only to see Renfield heading into there as well. As far as what we see in the film, it's unclear if Harker and Van Helsing have even conducted any sort of business on Lucy before this point. One could say that when Van Helsing says that he has some matters to attend to before Jonathan and Mina walk out and into the sunrise, it's inferred that what he means is that he's going to take care of Lucy after Dracula's been dealt with. But it's hard to say that the inference is warranted, because Van Helsing's statement here is so vague that he may very well mean that he's just gonna do some form of double tap on Dracula just to make sure that he stays dead and that this particular business has nothing to do with Lucy. And after Dracula's killed by Van Helsing, we see the curse being lifted off of Mina, but we never see anything like that regarding Lucy. And for the record, by the time we get to Dracula's daughter, which serves to directly follow up on this ending, Van Helsing's business is never established to relate to Lucy whatsoever. So yeah, at this point, this is a loose end that easily could have and should have been addressed, especially considering how Lucy was established to be one of Dracula's more prominent victims. Now, it's not to say that this whole thing with Lucy breaks the whole plot of Dracula in 1931. It certainly doesn't. The film still works overall, even with this issue, but it would have been nice if this issue had just been cleared up, or at the very least, wasn't some question mark left looming in the shadows. Still, despite that, the film still works overall, story-wise. So now let's get into the characters, who, at least a good portion of them, aren't really much to write home about. In fact, this film's portrayal of Mina is no more than a damsel in distress who is slowly being overtaken by the Count's hypnotic power, someone whose soul is to be in need of saving by her fiancé John Harker and Professor Van Helsing. She's not bad in that she overall remains congruent with who she is as a character, but there just isn't much to her beyond what I just said about her now. In fact, I'll just say that there are better iterations of Mina out there with much more nuance, depth, and the like. Winona Ryder's version from the 1992 film comes to mind. I'll also include Lucy from Nosferatu the Vampire, who is basically that film's version of Mina, but with a different name. Helen Chandler does well in portraying a woman in fear for her life and the people she loves, who finds herself overwhelmed in a conflict between people who intend to save her soul and an insidious being with great power who has a sight set on her, which may not make Mina the deepest character by any means, but there's still a solid enough foundation all the same. John Harker, played in this feature by David Manners, is even more bare bones as a character. What he mainly does is make observations, like when he points out an off-screen wolf outside, which is really Dracula in his wolf form, and he tries to get Mina back from the Count's clutches once the situation becomes all the more clear to him that perhaps the supernatural occurrences that Van Helsing claims to be real are, in fact, real. Though even then, his role in the film's climax is just looking for Mina after she's taken into Dracula's lair. Much like Mina, it's not that he's a poorly written character, because he does remain congruent as a decent man whose care and love for his fiancée outweigh his skepticism towards Van Helsing's warnings, even to the point where he nearly falls into a vampiric trap when an afflicted Mina tries to get a taste. It's just that he's mainly just kinda there. Yes, I know, we all would like to poke fun at Harker as he was portrayed by Keanu Reeves, but that's all in part due to Reeves, as much as we all love him, being a less than stellar casting choice, and not much to do with how the character was written, because Harker in that film at least had a little more dimension to him and had a little more to do. David Manners does a fair job with this role, as he would do in The Mummy 1932, where he would play a very similar role. It's just a shame that there isn't much to his character beyond, what we have here. So now, at this point, when it comes to its character work, Dracula 1931 is basically salvaged for the most part by three individuals. First, its title character, Count Dracula himself. Dracula is an undead being who seems to have lived hundreds of years to prey upon and feast on the blood of people, as well as to make brides for himself. He uses his charisma and hypnotic presence in order to come off as less suspicious and more alluring to his potential victims for him to either feast on or to transform into his vampiric slaves. Not only does he have great power, which allows him to achieve his predatory goals, from hypnosis to telepathic communication to transforming into a wolf or bat to sneak away from or into places, but, as Van Helsing puts it, his greatest advantage is the lack of superstition amongst most people, and that alone allows him to blend in and get away with his killings, as well as to gain a new follower in the unassuming Renfield. And that big advantage makes him scarier more than anything because of how easily he could just fly into an unsuspecting, unknowing person's room as a bat one night and, one may say, have a bite. It's even implied that the reason why Dracula moves from Transylvania is because the villagers who we meet at the beginning of the film have been making his nightly prowls all the more difficult due to them being fully aware of him and his brides being vampires. So naturally, him moving to a new foreign land allows the Count to hunt again uncontested. On top of all that, Bela Lugosi is nothing short of excellent in this role. Considering his background in theater, most notably when he performed as this character in Broadway, Lugosi essentially transforms into Count Dracula in this film. His mannerisms, the way his accent adds an extra layer of exoticism to the way his character speaks, and such, give Dracula a strong sense of menace, wearing the mask of prestige and charm. Lugosi also does a fantastic job in moments where Dracula's demeanor changes throughout certain scenes, changing from being cool and collected to acting out an instinct, such as when he sees Renfield accidentally shedding a bit of blood, or when Van Helsing tries to entrap him by showing him a mirror, in which the Count casts no reflection. Even without dialogue in some scenes, there's moments where just the look in Dracula's eyes speaks volumes about what's on his mind, such as when he stares or leers at Renfield, or Mina and Lucy with diabolical intent. The only letdown about this character would be how he was ultimately defeated. Not that it's badly executed or poorly written, it's just that I personally would have done it a little differently. Basically, after killing Renfield for inadvertently luring Jonathan Harker and Van Helsing to his lair, Dracula tries to escape with Mina in the Abbey, with Van Helsing and Harker on his tail. However, it's nearing sunrise, so he's forced to go back into his coffin after hiding Mina away. Considering how Van Helsing and Harker seem to be unarmed or at least insufficiently armed up to this point, it would have been nice to see Dracula try to make a last stand against the two men before going to sleep. Perhaps Dracula could have used the darkness and expansive layout of the Abbey to his advantage in order to catch Van Helsing or Harker off guard, or to use Mina as bait in order for Harker and Van Helsing to momentarily let their guard down and then try to kill them that way, so that he can make a mad dash into his coffin after killing them just in time. Again, not to say that the ending which we got here is bad mechanically speaking, considering it does adhere to Dracula needing to go back into his coffin to sleep before sunrise, and it would make sense for Dracula to potentially be in a state of panic at this point, but one can't really say that this film was going out with fireworks either, especially when we don't even get to see Dracula getting staked in the heart by Van Helsing. Yeah, I know, too graphic for the 30s, but still. So, my suggestion of Dracula refusing to go down without a fight or without taking others with him, as opposed to what we have here, could have at least spiced the ending up just a little bit, while still staying congruent with what we understand of Dracula's powers and limitations. All that being said, however, a somewhat underwhelming end to his reign of terror is by no means enough to take away from how captivating and scary of a villain Count Dracula is throughout the rest of the film. Next up, we have our second character, who actually has the most amount of depth to him, who is none other than Dracula's lackey, Renfield. Starting out as a broker, Renfield has been sent to Transylvania to meet with a mysterious count in order to seal a deal involving a property in Carfax Abbey. Despite many locals warning him to not go to Borgo Pass, which is where Dracula resides, Renfield passes these warnings off as products of mere superstition and still insists on going to Castle Dracula. After which, he is given a necklace with a crucifix for protection, not knowing of what awaits him. After he is trapped in Dracula's castle, like a fly that has found itself caught in a spider's web, Renfield ends up being turned by the Count into a servant who gains an overwhelming craving for insects and rodents. For all of his creepy mannerisms and deliciously eccentric and dark demeanor, which are all very entertaining, we still see glimpses of the decent man who we saw at the beginning of the film, desperately trying to reach out and fight the corruption which he has been afflicted by. This makes Renfield a pretty tragic character, all things considered, when we see him helplessly pleading to the men holding him in the sanitarium to heed his warnings, as well as when he even pleads to his master to leave Mina be. His death at the hands of Dracula towards the end of the film is also tragic when we consider the context of him being no less of a victim of the Count's curse than anyone else, considering that he started out as an innocent man just doing his job, who, while understandably so, was ignorant of the supernatural evil that awaited him. I can understand if one were to call his death cheesy due to how we didn't really see much of Dracula killing him, as well as Fry throwing his all into portraying his character getting killed, just like how he was throwing his all into every other scene, but it doesn't make things any less tragic seeing Renfield basically having his life changed forever and in the worst way imaginable, only for his master to just kill him and toss his body aside once he is deemed as an inconvenience. So overall, Renfield is a pretty well done, well realized character who is also bolstered by Dwight Fry's creepy and magnetic performance. Lastly, we have our third character, Professor Van Helsing, who acts to convince the skeptics into believing his claims of Dracula being a vampire. He is very much resilient to where he is able to overcome Dracula's hypnotic power, and it's his unflinching resilience and resolve that give him the edge to defeat him. Even in the face of disbelief from others, the professor remains calm, vigilant, and persistent in order to try to convince Harker and Seward of the truth about Dracula and to save Mina. He's also one to state a course when it comes to stopping Dracula in that, despite the skepticism and uncertainty which others would rightfully express, Van Helsing will not hesitate to try to prove his vampire theory is correct or to personally challenge Dracula himself. Not to mention, Edward Van Sloan does a great job playing this character and basically sells every line of dialogue which he utters. You fully believe that this man knows his stuff and that he doesn't mess around when it comes to matters of the undead. Considering how well Van Sloan does at playing Van Helsing here, it's no wonder why we would see him again in both Frankenstein and The Mummy, albeit as different characters from Van Helsing, of course. So, the basic gist about the characters in Dracula 1931 is that they range from decent yet minimal in terms of depth to pretty darn good, and they do pretty well in bolstering the film's storyline. Now, in terms of how the film holds up on a technical level, it does well given its limitations. It's understandable how difficult it would be for the filmmakers to pull off a good effort of Dracula transforming into a bat or a wolf, so it seems that going for a more minimal approach by having him transform off screen may have been the right choice. Not to mention, the set design is amazing, especially when we go into Dracula's castle or into his lair in Carfax Abbey, which are beautifully crafted as far as giving off the atmosphere of being such dark, foreboding places filled with cobwebs, dilapidation, clouds of fog, and critters freely roaming around. Even with, for example, the more inviting setting of the room where Dracula and Renfield conduct their business, there's still an eerie atmosphere of something darker waiting to overwhelm the latter. Sure, there are some moments which stick out as kinda silly, like how the bats and spider are puppeteered and how the boat which Dracula rode on looked like it was a toy being splashed around in a pool or bathtub, but the filmmakers were at least smart enough to not have those shots linger on for too long due to their limitations at the time. While these things are noticeable, they don't detract much from the film by any means in terms of how it's all put together, from the gorgeous set design to the neat garnishing in those sets in terms of making them all the more natural, or supernatural, wink wink. And while this spectacularly gothic look is primarily present during the first half of the film, the atmosphere still manages to stick around throughout the rest of the runtime, even long after the Count moves from Transylvania. All that being said, however, the film isn't really shot in the most dynamic way. While the cinematography by Karl Freund, who will go on to direct The Mummy 1932, does well in capturing the scale and atmosphere of some of these settings, and while there are some dynamic shots here and there, such as when we first meet Dracula or when we see him walking through the foggy streets of London, for the most part, the cinematography is pretty much stationary, with any shots with a sense of dynamism being few and far between, especially once we get into the second half of the film, where we mostly find ourselves at Dr. Seward's sanitarium. This stationary method of cinematography makes the film come off as more of a stage play that was filmed as opposed to a cinematic feature, which is ironic considering that the movie itself is more based on a stage play anyways than Bram Stoker's novel. And it's a technical shortcoming which is actually rectified by the Spanish version of this film, that was produced simultaneously with a Spanish director, cast, crew, you name it. While Dracula 31 may not have the technical fidelity that cinema would go on to see from the the likes of James Whale and his forays into the Universal Monsters catalog, it's still a fairly well-made film overall for its time, and Todd Browning and crew did a great job at capturing the creepy, dark, gothic atmosphere of the whole thing, making several moments in the film all the more memorable on a visual level. So, when it's all said and done, there's definitely a good reason why Dracula 1931 is considered by many to be a classic. Though it's not without some undercooked elements here and there, and while it's certainly not the best entry in the Universal Monsters catalog, the film has a great atmosphere to it, the story is engaging, even for as much of a slow burn as it is, and, well, what can I even say about Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Count Dracula that hasn't been said already? I mean, this portrayal in terms of presentation will forever stand as the definitive Dracula. The same can also be said about Dwight Frye's portrayal of Redfield, who is also featured rather prominently throughout the film and as a show stealer. It's a film that I still kinda love, and it's still good, even with its flaws in mind, and it's still an essential watch, especially for the Halloween season. And it's certainly a film that I would, in fact, recommend to others. So that pretty much does it for this essay video of mine on Dracula 1931. I would like to thank you all very much for watching and for following me, to those who have up to this point. Now, as far as what to expect from me next when it comes to discussions about the Universal Monsters, I'll be sure to keep you all up to date in terms of when the next project relating to the subject matter will be, so stay tuned for that as well as any other projects which I have in store. Once more, thank you for watching, and until when the Children of the Night make their music again, I will see you all later.